For your lectures on the cardiovascular system, I've lumped the first two standards together and the last two standards together. So the first set of content that we're going to talk about, Heart 1 and 2, discusses the different blood vessels that exist in this system, categorizes them by anatomy as well as their physiology, and discusses the two primary circuits that blood follows while it's on its path throughout your body. The Heart 1 standard reads, I can compare the structures and functions of the major types of blood vessels, while Heart 2 traces blood flow through pulmonary and systemic circuits. All right, Unit 10 is all about the cardiovascular system. So we're talking about the heart, we're talking about blood vessels, and the one-way flow of blood throughout your body. Of course, if we're talking about blood, we need to talk about gas exchange because that is the primary function of our red blood cells, is to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the tissues in our body. So we see this kind of four-point loop all around the heart between the upper body, lower body, right lung, and left lung. So this system, like I said, is comprised of heart and blood vessels, and it is responsible for that movement of blood. It pumps about 7,000 liters of blood daily. Now, of course, it's the same liters of blood over and over again, but it has a very high output. In the average lifetime, 80 some years, the heart will beat about 2.5 billion times. We are going to talk about two circuits today. First, the pulmonary circuit, which is any time we're discussing blood flow to or away from the lungs. Doesn't matter which one. And of course, this circuit, since we're talking about lungs, is about dropping off CO2 for us to breathe out and picking up fresh oxygen from the lungs. The systemic circuit is the upper and lower body circuit. So we're talking heart and body. And this is going to have the opposite set of criteria. We're going to drop off oxygen to those tissues and pick up their carbon dioxide waste. Okay, Heart.1 covers specific blood vessels. So we are going to start in the upper right corner of this picture and kind of go down and around. So if we were starting in the heart, blood is carried away from the heart in arteries, and that's how I remember that, arteries away. Arteries have really thick, strong walls because they're under immense blood pressure being right after the heart, the muscle power for the entire flow. There's smooth muscle here that sort of coerces blood in that one directional flow, and a lot of elastic tissue so that we don't have ruptures. Your aorta, which is the first major blood vessel that comes out of your heart, has to maintain this stretch because if there were a split there, there would be this very quick internal bleeding that would lead to death. From those thick arteries, we have slightly smaller versions of arteries, and those are called arterioles. So we're carrying the blood from the arteries towards our tiny capillaries. Capillaries are, I would say, the most important vessel. These are your single cell wall thickness blood vessels that are carrying the blood that will exchange gases. So what I'm trying to say is that they're really, really, really thin, but that's good because they're permeable to gas exchange. So this is where we're going to trade oxygen and carbon dioxide. To make them that thin, they have to be made of a very delicate epithelial tissue, simple squamous. From there, capillaries will start to spill together into much larger vessels called venules, which will then again collect and spill into larger veins. And veins carry blood towards the heart. So sometimes I think of these as highways, busy streets, and then side streets, how you have this like narrow branching and branching and branching to get to a very specific place, but then eventually you'll go from that specific place to a more broad and busy blood vessel. Veins are under low pressure because they're so far away from the heart, and to remedy that, to make sure blood gets back, you have valves that prevent this backflow. So these valves, you can see the walls are a lot thinner because we don't need them for the pressure that they're under, but there are going to be valves in here to push blood forward. So what's happening in the capillaries? Well, we're exchanging gases, but not only that, we're exchanging nutrients like glucose, we're exchanging waste products, perhaps even hormones or entire cells like white blood cells. So we have to have methods of moving the right things across the capillary membrane. And there's three mechanisms by which we do this. Diffusion happens on the arterial end of the capillary, so the first parts. And this is where we have really small molecules, like maybe our gases, O2 and CO2, exchanged from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So for instance, if we're in the lungs have a high concentration of O2, so we're going to see O2 diffuse into the blood. If we're in the body, the opposite will be true. The body has a lower concentration of O2 than the blood, so we'll see O2 migrate outward. A process called filtration is also happening down here at the arterial end, and this is where we use hydrostatic pressure. We use the pressure of water to force larger molecules like maybe glucose across those capillary walls. So on this side we have gases, we have sugars, all those things pushing across, which makes sense because they're under higher pressure over here. On the other end, on the venial end, that's where we start to put some water back because we're under lower pressure. And so osmosis is water traveling from high to low pressure, and that's the last thing we'll exchange. Notice that the title has changed. This is HEART.2, where we're going to discuss what are the specific names of those two circuits. I would take these notes in red and blue, where red signifies any blood vessel that has a high oxygen content and a low CO2 content, and then blue has a low oxygen and high CO2 content. So because it's a circuit, we have to pick an arbitrary starting point. I'm going to start in the right ventricle of the heart. That's the bottom. So since we're on the right side, and you notice I put it in blue, I'll tell you we need oxygen, so we got to go to the lungs. If we're going to leave the heart and we're going away from the heart, we're going to need an artery because we're going away. So we call that the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary means lung. So this entire circuit is all about getting to the lungs and back. Arteries will branch into pulmonary arterioles, which will branch into tiny pulmonary capillaries. And I drew these in purple because this is where the gases are exchanged. So depending on where you are in the capillary, you might have high O2, you might have low O2. But what happens in this capillary is we pick up the O2 into our blood and we drop off the CO2 waste. From there, we branch tiny capillaries into a little bit larger pulmonary venules, pulmonary veins, and then eventually we make it back to the heart. But we'll make it to the other side, the left atrium. So we've gone to the lungs, we were deoxygenated before, we had arteries, arterioles, and then we picked up our oxygen, venules, veins, back to the heart. That's the pulmonary circuit. Go to the lungs. The systemic circuit, new title, is what's happening in the body tissues. So we were in the left atrium of the heart. We're going to move down to the left ventricle. We still have that oxygen. We need to deliver it to the body now. We're going away from the heart. So we're going to go through a really big artery called the aorta. I mentioned it earlier. It's really important that this is a stretchy, thick-walled artery, and it gets its own special name. So the aorta branches into systemic arteries, which starts heading towards body tissues. Those branch into systemic arterioles and eventually into our systemic capillaries. Again, purple because this is where our gas exchange takes place. The O2 is delivered to the tissues, and while we're there, we pick up CO2 into the blood, spill into larger systemic venules, larger systemic veins, and then make it back to the right atrium of our heart. So capillaries are gas exchange. This is just the opposite cycle where we have oxygen and we're dropping it off. This is a comprehensive picture that kind of shows everything that's happening. I said we were going to the lungs, pick up oxygen, back to the heart, go out to the body, deliver oxygen, back to the heart. And it's a completely random chance which pathway a blood cell might take. You see these forks in the road. It could go to the right or left. It could go to the upper or lower body. Um, it's just chance which path they happen to take. Your case study in this cardiovascular unit is about myocardial infarction. We'll learn what that's a fancy name for and who is most at risk.